The Roads to Carbon Neutral, presented by TotalEnergies. Hello, I'm Emma Crosby. Welcome to The Roads to Carbon Neutral. This series examines how countries, companies and communities have set a clear goal to achieve net zero carbon emissions by mid-century. In this edition, we'll look at significant ways to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere and the groundbreaking technologies leading the way. Coming up, we discuss why the removal of CO2 is critical to address the climate issue.
It is impossible to get to net zero by 2050 without CCUS and CCS.
Reporter Emmeline Nsingi-Nkosi examines the role of nature-based solutions in capturing carbon.
Plus, we take a look at one of the most important commercial carbon storage projects in Europe.
And we feature the tech innovators and entrepreneurs forging ahead in this sector.
It's rare to be able to combine something that you love doing with something that is great for the world.
To begin, let's examine the current role of carbon capture within the energy sector. We'll hear from business leaders and academics on why carbon capture is part of the response to global warming. The Industrial Revolution transformed economies that had been based on agriculture into economies based on large-scale industry and mechanized manufacturing. Some 375 billion tonnes of carbon have been emitted by humans into the atmosphere since then. The steady increase in CO2 in our atmosphere due to human activity is damaging our ecosystem. Therefore, the focus is on how to avoid emissions from the outset, to reduce what's emitted through better practices, and finally compensate what's being released via carbon capture.
The quantity of carbon that is moving around in these cycles is huge, many hundreds of millions of tons. The anthropogenic or the human contribution to this system, it's actually a relatively small fraction, but the issue is that over time the human contribution to this system, it builds up and thus is sufficient to destabilize that system, and that's why we're in the sort of quandary that we're in today.
The carbon cycle consists of sources which emit CO2 into the air and carbon sinks which extract CO2. Oceans and forests absorb CO2 naturally, but since the industrial age, an imbalance has been created. Burning petrol, coal and gas adds about 43 billion tonnes of CO2 a year into our atmosphere. The CO2 which isn't absorbed gets trapped in the atmosphere, and this heats up our planet.
From a mass energy balance perspective, we got into the mess of climate change because we took carbon out from underground, extracted its energy, and let it go into the atmosphere. The only way that we can reverse that, it makes sense, is to take that carbon out of the atmosphere, then use energy, renewable energy, to put it back underground.
There are three main methods currently being used to capture carbon emissions. Through carbon capture and storage, also known as CCS. The process of capturing CO2 at the source, for example within the emitting plants, and transporting it to a storage site where it will not enter the atmosphere. Through carbon capture and utilization, this time to recycle the CO2 for further usage. Or by accelerating nature-based solutions through reforestation can be very effective.
Carbon capture, utilization, and storage has seen tremendous growth over the past few years. A lot of this is driven in part, of course, by the need to get to net zero by 2050, but also because of the realization that even if we were to go to 100% renewable electricity tomorrow, we would not be able to completely decarbonize our society.
In 2020 alone, 40 million tonnes of CO2 were captured from power and industrial facilities. This is 1,000 times less, though, than what we emit today. CCS can remove 90 to 95% of an industrial facility's emissions. According to the International Energy Agency, this method could reduce greenhouse gas emissions worldwide by up to 14% by 2050. Globally, the goal by 2050 is to capture approximately 7,600 million tonnes of CO2 to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. In comparison to what can be captured today, we have a long way to go.
By the time we get to 2050, we will need CCS to remove the equivalent of between 10 and 20% of the world's carbon emissions. The CCS industry will need to get over 100 times bigger over the next 3 decades. And you can see the scale of that challenge. It's absolutely huge, but it also represents a really massive opportunity for investment and growth for the companies that are involved.
Today's technology has improved efficiencies. CCS is still used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by capturing CO2 directly at gas processing facilities and at power plants. CO2 can be captured from where it was produced using a liquid solvent or other separation methods. After capture, carbon dioxide is compressed and then transported via ship or in a pipeline to sit where it's injected underground for permanent storage. Or the CO2 is sunk to under 3,500 meters under the ocean.
The fundamental technology concepts that underpin CCS, they're actually incredibly mature. These ideas have been deployed around the world in a commercial context for example, fertilizer industry, natural gas production. Today, I think in the US, there's something like 60 million tons of CO2 being moved around. And this is transported via something like 7,000 miles of pipelines.
A lot of people will say, is this safe? Will CO2 go back into the atmosphere? Well, think about how much effort we put into drilling down into these depleted oil wells or these saline aquifers that are rock hard and have stored these things for millions of years. It makes a lot of sense that they will be secure and stable if we were to put carbon dioxide back in there.
CO2 transport by ship, that is also an interesting part because some countries have a lot of storage capacity, but they have very few emission sources like Norway. And then you've got countries with a lot of industry, but no storage possibilities like Germany. And so likely we will see in the future much more transport between countries from emission sources to storage.
This sector is still in its infancy and not yet used on a commercial scale. Today, there are fewer than 25 CCUS facilities in operation around the world, not enough to capture the upcoming amounts needed. Besides storing CO2, it's also possible to convert it into reusable products. Commercial uses of CO2 include plastics, biofuels, lubricants and cement, as well as for food and beverage production.
One of the conundrums of CCS right now is the economic viability. So there is no ready-made business model for CCS. And companies that are addressing this solution will have to come together, be brave, take fresh approaches to make this a commercial enterprise. And governments have a big role to play here too. Ultimately, we need a communal solution to what is a communal problem in our CO2 emissions.
It requires political leadership to stand up and say, this is crucial to meet net zero. It's a cost-effective solution and we're going to do it.
In the coming decades, further CO2 capture and utilization methods could help solve our current climate change dilemma. Advancements in technology, global policy and private investment could create a $1 trillion opportunity while also helping to save our planet.
We need carbon capture, utilization and storage. It is impossible to get to net zero by 2050 without CCUS and CCS.
Ecosystems right here on our planet already have the ability to store carbon naturally. Reporter Emmeline Nsingi-Nkosi has been looking at the role of preserving and restoring carbon sinks.
The ocean, atmosphere, soil and forest are the world's largest carbon sinks. The world's forests provide a carbon sink that absorbs a net 7.6 billion metric tons of CO2 per year. The Earth's soil soaks up roughly a quarter of all human emissions each year, with a large portion of this stored in peatland or permafrost. And our oceans and the microorganisms living within them do an excellent job of mopping up excess heat from the atmosphere. In fact, they currently absorb 2.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. Scientific study into how to preserve natural carbon sinks in the fight against greenhouse gas emissions is gathering pace. TotalEnergies is investing in natural carbon sinks to ensure that biodiversity is taken into account across all its activities. As a result, the group has created Nature-Based Solutions business unit.
So the group decided for a third type of activity, a third line of operation that is essential to continuing to produce energy in a world that can be sustainable. And this new line of operation is about carbon sequestration and carbon footprint final offsetting or neutralization. And so TotalEnergies Nature-Based Solutions is one of the line of operations to serve and reach that final goal and objective. We've been partnering in Australia with a developer that will gather farmers so as to transition from rather intensive pasture management to more regenerative pasture management, and that's optimizing both value for farming practices and also carbon sequestration. Another example would be an operation for conservation of very vast surfaces of Amazonian forests, but also strengthening local value chains. And of course, the big part is still left to do. We are starting. It's a pioneering adventure.
Countries around the world are starting to see real benefits from investing in carbon sinks, and some are shining examples that it is indeed possible to be carbon negative. Bhutan has managed to successfully become a carbon negative country. More than 70% of Bhutan is covered in trees, and this large amount of tree cover absorbs roughly 7 million tons of carbon dioxide annually, whilst the country only produces around 2 million tons. China may be the world's biggest source of human-produced CO2, responsible for around 28% of global emissions, but it recently stated an intention to peak those emissions before 2030 and then to move to carbon neutrality by 2060. As part of this, China has adopted an aggressive policy of planting trees in China's southwest provinces. Russia is home to 20% of global forests, the equivalent of about 640 billion trees. Managed forests in Russia are estimated to have absorbed nearly 620 million tons of carbon equivalent in 2018, according to the country's latest data, enough to offset around 38% of national emissions. Meanwhile, countries near the ocean are focusing on preserving their coastal ecosystems. Mangroves, tidal marshes and seagrass meadows sequester and store more carbon per unit area than terrestrial forests. Governments, non-state actors and businesses will continue to work together to improve CCS and nature-based solutions in order to reach net zero by 2050.
To discuss further how TotalEnergies is speeding up the deployment of low-carbon solutions across its activities, I'm pleased to say I'm joined now by Bruno Cellon, TotalEnergies Vice President of CCUS, to discuss the work of his division. Hi there, Bruno. So Bruno, how long has TotalEnergies been investing in carbon sinks and carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies?
It started a long time ago. We have more than 25 years experience in CCS. It started in Norway, in the North Sea, with decarbonization of the natural gas that we were producing. Then, once captured, we were transporting that CO2 and storing it under the sea in a rock. We grew from that experience and expertise with various projects, whether R&D projects testing the overall chain from the industries to the transportation and the storage.
So Bruno, how big is the opportunity for CCUS?
Today, the CCUS industry is very small at the scale of the planet. The International Energy Agency says that the CCUS industry is going to grow immensely in the coming years. From today 40 million tons per annum of CO2 captured and stored to more than 800 million tons per annum in 2030.
And can you tell us about the TotalEnergies CCUS projects underway?
Well, Northern Lights project is the first CO2 shipping and storage project to be initiated in the world. We have taken the investment decision with our partners and the government of Norway last year in 2020. So the first phase of that project will be able to accommodate up to 1.5 million tons per annum of CO2. And then you have two industries there, a cement manufacturer and a waste incinerator. They're capturing the CO2, they're putting the CO2 at disposal in a shipping terminal. And you have two ships invented by Northern Lights and the partners of Northern Lights to take the CO2, put it on the vessel, and then ship that CO2 all along the coast of Norway to go into the west part of Norway, where we have a receiving terminal. At that shipping terminal, the CO2 will be transferred first into an intermediary storage, and then will go from there to the offshore, under the sea, in the rock. There is a subsea installation with a well, and that injection well will go 2,600 meters, approximately, into the rock. We are experimenting on ourselves, on our industrial assets. And we do that first in one of our refineries in the Netherlands, where we produce hydrogen. So it's a good example of an integrated industrial chain that we are experimenting on ourselves in order to bring the service to others.
As Bruno mentioned, the Northern Lights is a cutting-edge carbon capture project, the first of its kind, which will see the Norwegian government, TotalEnergies, Shell and Equinor work together to transport CO2 by sea and move it to permanent underground storage on a commercial scale.
The important work of research and development builds a strong foundation for the future. As we work towards bringing breakthrough technology to mass scale, most countries and businesses are taking action now to curb CO2 release into our atmosphere by putting a price on carbon emissions. In a country-by-country breakdown, China, the United States and India combined are responsible for more than half of all carbon emissions. It wasn't until 2021 that China launched an official national emissions trading scheme. Finland was ahead of the curve, the first to introduce the carbon tax in 1990. Two countries reinvest the tax into their citizens. Canada have implemented that 90% of carbon tax revenue is to be returned to residents. And in Switzerland, 2/3 of all carbon tax revenues are reimbursed to consumers via a health insurance rebate. Corporations are taking responsibility too. A survey of close to 6,000 large businesses revealed that more than 1/3 are using an internal carbon price or are planning to implement one by 2023. In 2015, TotalEnergies and 5 other leading energy companies called on the international community to implement carbon pricing mechanisms. Ultimately, a price on carbon aims to reflect its economic cost. The money generated can be reinvested into people and used to stimulate innovation in the growth of clean technologies. As we've seen, capturing carbon dioxide is a major weapon in the fight against climate change. Innovation and R&D is advancing breakthrough technologies in this space. TotalEnergies wants to be at the forefront of this in 2 ways. Firstly, through the work of its own research and development team, and secondly, by supporting a growing number of smaller companies who make it their business to clean up emissions.
At the moment, there are around 20 projects around the world which are looking at carbon capture and storage, so our CCUS part. These projects capture around 40 million tons of CO2 per year and store it or reutilize it. What we need by 2050 is well over 100 times more than this. So in terms of groundbreaking projects within TotalEnergies, I think the first one that we should mention is the Northern Lights project. The idea is to be able to take CO2 from many sources around Europe, and it should lead to the first, let's say, business for transport and storage. A second project is a little bit linked to this. This is a project where we're trying to understand what we call reservoir modeling. So we're going to inject the CO2 into different types of reservoirs. We have to be able to understand these reservoirs. Remember, these are deep underground, 1 kilometer underground. What we need now are simulation tools specific for CO2. This partnership is with the University of Stanford in the US and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. The third project that I think we've done very well is working with a Canadian startup called Svante. Svante have developed technology to capture the CO2. We know how to capture CO2 from a flue gas, from a source, since the 1970s, so for over 50 years. We've been injecting CO2 underground for 40 years, since the 1980s. We have had large-scale projects in the North Sea since the early 2000s. So this technology, to a large extent, isn't new. However, what we do know is that it is expensive. And if we want to move forward in a sustainable society, we have to try and find technologies which are cheaper than they are now. Also, more and more companies are seeing that they need to be sustainable. And one of the ways is, of course, to capture.
TotalEnergies is fully integrating the climate challenge into its strategy. The group's investment arm, TotalEnergies Ventures, is focused entirely on assisting small businesses. It's increased its funding capacity to $400 million per year by 2025. One of its managing directors, Cindy Choi, explains further.
So TotalEnergies Ventures has 3 key criteria when we look at new investments. 1 is financial return, 2 is strategic relevance, and the 3rd is carbon neutrality. So specifically, in the carbon neutrality side, we are looking at technologies in carbon recycling. Specifically, carbon recycling is using industrial waste gases and finding a new value stream for them. It could be protein, for example, it could be a bioplastic, it could be something that could be like a biostimulant for the soil. While the road to carbon neutrality is long and some technologies will take some time to get there in terms of cost competitiveness, we are really excited about some carbon technologies that are a little bit further out in terms of TRL, technology readiness level. So they're in the later stages, they are closer to industrialization and scale, and we think that can make an impact in the closer term, let's call it in the next 1 to 3 years.
Global demand for cement is growing exponentially. It's second only to the demand for water. Solidia has developed a cement production process not only emitting less CO2, but also using CO2 as an input.
The global cement industry faces a major carbon dioxide problem. Specifically, about 4 billion tons of cement are produced globally. For every ton of cement produced, 0.9 tons of CO2 are also produced. And Solidia, a startup company we invested in, is one of the potential ways to improve this problem. What Solidia does is they have a cement production process that is 30 to 40% less in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and they also use CO2 to combine with the materials for hardening, and thus is essentially a permanent storage for carbon. Deep Branch transforms carbon dioxide with the hydrogen gas feedstock through a microbial fermentation process to make a sustainable protein.
Founded in 2018, the company is a fast-growing startup operating in both the UK and the Netherlands.
Deep Branch aims to create a high-value protein ingredient for animal feed, and we're going to do it in a way that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. The process is actually pretty simple. We take gaseous feedstocks of hydrogen, which is the energy for the bacteria, and carbon dioxide, which is fixed into proteins, and just simple salt solutions. And the bacteria is essentially a factory for making protein out of those ingredients. The secret sauce of it is really the microorganism. It's a very rare microorganism that can use carbon dioxide and fix it in the same way that plants do. And it uses the hydrogen gas as an energy, which is the really unique thing there. Instead of using sunlight for energy, it uses the hydrogen.
So far, the protein produced by Deep Branch is used as animal feedstocks for the fish and poultry industries.
Bacteria is grown in a bioreactor, which is essentially some salty water which we bubble gases through hydrogen and carbon dioxide. Then the challenge is to separate the bacteria out from that liquid. So we have some liquid and then some bacterial pellet there. Then we need to turn that pellet into a powder form by drying it out. Then we send the powder to the feed manufacturers who combine it with lots of other ingredients to make some pellets which are eventually fed to the animal.
Deep Branch connects directly to a source of CO2 at Drax, a UK power plant, which plans to switch from coal to biomass electricity generation. With a facility on site, Deep Branch proves wherever there are CO2 emissions, their business model has a place.
It's rare to be able to combine something that you love doing with something that is great for the world.
TotalEnergies Ventures is not just capital, we are also embracing them from all angles. So one, in terms of our engineering support, in terms of our expertise and knowledge, perhaps on the feedstock and gases, also in terms of providing sites. So for Deep Branch, they are looking for sites where they could put their next big commercial plant. So we are in discussions with Deep Branch and how to help them accelerate their commercialization.
TotalEnergies is working with companies like Solidia and Deep Branch to cement a net zero future where sustainability is business as usual. Well, that's all we've got time for. As we've seen, carbon capture has a significant role to play when it comes to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. If you'd like to find out more, please visit roadtocarbonneutral.com. Thank you for watching and goodbye. The Roads to Carbon Neutral, presented by TotalEnergies.